Hello, welcome to Go Library. This is Dr. Ming. We continue our program, Maura's Moxie, talking about the CCP's accomplices in the US. The questions are, how have the American elites in Washington, Silicon Valley, and Wall Street, as well as business associations, human rights organizations, and world-class universities, sold out America to the CCP? What made Maura write about Google kowtowing to the CCP in 2008? How has the Americans' political sentiment towards the CCP changed? Over to Maura.
Billionaire elites take the side of the CCP, and many of our politicians who've been bought by the CCP and take CCP money happily with no shame at all.
No.
And those same elites, those American elites, sold out the American people when they shipped all their jobs to communist China.
Yeah, we will talk about,
we'll talk about the headquarters of IBM, International Business Machines. It started the first generation of personal computers.
Yeah.
And it had Corning, and it had Kodak and Polaroid and all of these tech companies. They're all gone. And what do we have instead in upstate New York, instead of research laboratories and thriving communities? We have fentanyl. We have broken communities. We have broken lives. I was shocked when I went to Poughkeepsie a couple of years ago, where Vassar College is. Again, IBM used to be a big employer there. In the middle of the day, I saw so many grown men passed out on the main street with needles in their arms from the opioid crisis. And I saw all of the main streets for sale, for rent, or broken down, and people doing crack cocaine in what 20, 30 years ago was a thriving community is now a broken shell. And we also know that fentanyl is coming from communist China through cartels in Mexico. But we also don't see the elites coming to the defense of the American people. They're coming to the defense of the CCP as their fellow countrymen die 3 a minute in New York. Probably more. It's going to be 100,000 deaths by the weekend, according to projections by doctors. So I had an idea that I wanted to share with you and your listeners.
Yeah, this is basically we now move to the topic of the CCP's accomplices in the US. Yeah. So we must there's lots of things to explore. So my question, what is the view about this? So you talk about this CCP's accomplices. So how they affect your community. So what is the book you are going to share with us, which is a good one?
Oh yes, it's now sold out. My friend Rosemary Gibson wrote this wonderful book called China RX.
What does that mean?
The risks of America's dependence on China for medicine.
All right.
And this book came out in 2018. And typically, no one would put Rosemary on their talk shows. Nobody would interview her. Steve Bannon put her up on War Room Pandemic. And now that the lockdown has come, now that people are traumatized, now that people are dying and people have lost their jobs and they've lost their security and their pensions, the book sold out. And the book tells the story of how it started with Bill Clinton in 1994, when he gave Communist China permanent normal trading relations and then got them into the WTO. All of our medical supplies got outsourced mostly to China. The last penicillin factory in the United States was in Syracuse, New York, in upstate New York, and it closed in 2004. So very soon we're going to see shortages of urgently needed medical supplies, not just masks, not just gowns, aspirin, penicillin that you give your children if they have an ear infection, heparin for heart operations. And we've seen what they've done in Australia in the last couple of months. I know you've reported very well on the story of a CCP businessman who bought up all of these private hospitals in Australia, closed them as the pandemic started, shipped millions of masks and personal protective gear back to China. Same happened in America.
Yeah, it involves halving your production.
Go ahead and die. The message is go ahead and die.
Yeah, indeed. Yes. That's a very good book. And also, if it's possible, could you introduce her to me? I'd like to interview her. Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, yes, because I think that's a very, very relevant topic to address in terms of how, when Clinton administration allowed China to enter the WTO, then just in less than 4 years, your supply chain for the medical projection almost most of them starting, or almost half of them already moved to China.
Oh, yeah.
So and now you can even do not produce the basic medicines, and that's not the worst. You know what? In China, there were so many scandals about these, fake medicines, the vaccines, for children. It's terrible. It's terrible.
Mm-hmm.
So
yes.
and
Yes.
so
Terrible. Well,
you think about how can the American trust the Chinese medicines, producing that way. So because it's all corruption.
Mm-hmm.
And those big, say, pharmaceuticals, they are agents of the CCPs.
They certainly appear to be, don't they? So here's another book I'd like to share with your viewers. This one is called Chinese Business Etiquette. Put it over here so you can see it.
Wow.
Chinese Business Etiquette. And the man, Scott D. Seligman, is the author. But one of his blurbs comes from a man called Mr. James McGregor, who lives in Shanghai, who used to run AmCham Shanghai. AmCham means American Chamber of Commerce. The AmCham Shanghai Twitter feed has always been the most blatant and naked display of the elite's preference for China's one-party communist dictatorship over what they call our messy democracy. They've really toned it down since the lockdown happened, but don't worry, guys. I've got screenshots. I've been following you, and I have a file with all the things you've said, the outrageous things that you've said about the Chinese people and about the American people. Well, here's a good one from Mr. James McGregor that he said in an interview at the end of January, when everyone in the elite in China knew full well that this pandemic was raging out of Wuhan, and they let everybody travel for Lunar New Year, which was January 15th.
Yeah.
Oh, January 29th, Mr. McGregor gave an interview where he was saying, we've done such a great job relocating the American supply chain to China, and we have bigger plans to have for the future. And all this talk about the concentration camps in Xinjiang is so much blather. So much blather. What if it was his mother, his father, his child, or himself being tortured in a communist concentration camp for the crime of practicing your religion or expressing your ethnic identity? He doesn't care about human life. I would like all these elites to go and spend a day in a Chinese concentration camp and then tell us how terrific it was. So much blather.
Yes, that's about the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai. Oh, there are lots of stories.
Follow you can find feed.
Yes.
Follow them.
Yeah. Okay. Would you like to talk about those bankers in Wall Street? So, have you? So, for example, tell us your writing about Google. Oh wow, that's Silicon Valley, and the CCP in 2008. So, what made you write it? You talk about you published an article about it.
Question. Thank you for asking these very straightforward questions, because why did I write it? Because it was shocking, and it was morally reprehensible, and it was outrageous.
Okay.
And to see that what happened was executives from Yahoo and Google and Bill Gates's Microsoft, don't forget Big Bill Gates, CCP collaborator #1. Oh, sorry, Tim Cook, and also Bill Clinton. They were hauled before a congressional committee to explain why they were collaborating with the Chinese Communist Party, why they were doing technology transfers with the Chinese Communist Party, and why they were censoring content that the Chinese Communist Party felt was sensitive.
Yes.
Like those pesky concentration camps in Tibet and Xinjiang. And they basically waffled. You know, they took the Fifth Amendment and they just kept on doing it because most politicians have been bought and sold by the same Wall Street criminals who sold us out to the CCP, who wine and dine. Xi Jinping, Hu Jintao, Li Peng, Jiang Zemin, all these characters, whenever they come to town, they get a red carpet. They get a banquet. Mark Zuckerberg is always there. Bill Gates is there. Everybody's smiling for her, but the poor Dalai Lama, His Holiness Dalai Lama, in 2009, President Obama declined to meet with the Dalai Lama. He was the first president since George H.W. Bush first met with the Dalai Lama to refuse to receive him in the White House from Chinese pressure, and also because his Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, insisted upon it because she's so tight with the CCP. And then Obama realized his folly when the CCP double-crossed him at the Copenhagen Climate Summit. So he did agree to meet the Dalai Lama, but it was through the back door. And the photograph that went around the world was the Dalai Lama going by the trash in the White House. Not good optics. Xi Jinping comes, he gets a red carpet and the fine wine, and everyone wants their picture taken with him. Well, it's not going to be a very good look now when you've got tens of thousands of Americans whose lives have been destroyed by the CCP virus. So I think this is a very critical moment. Back to your question about these elites. Here's an idea that I came up with many, many years ago. And I abandoned it because in the Tibet movement, the problem we have is we have no resources. No one will fund us. You can't get a penny to do any serious work about Tibet. Believe me, I've tried. You'd be able to get like a little consultancy here, maybe a 1 month funding there on a writing assignment here or there, whatever, but not enough to really take on the most powerful people in our society who have empowered the criminals who hold hostage the 1.4 billion people in China. You know, you need resources to do this, and we never had any. All we had was moral outrage, and we were relentless. I used to say that the Tibet activists, we were like squirrels. We're little, we're small, but we have sharp teeth, and it's our job to chip away at their narrative. And one day, maybe the tree will fall down. And if somebody didn't do something, that would be shameful and a disgrace. Well, at least somebody did something. At least myself and Students for a Free Tibet, we were out there every time a Chinese dictator came to town with our Tibetan flags, chanting China lies, people die. And which side are you on, boys? That's a question I'd like to ask these Wall Street elites.
Yeah.
Can see them very nervous right now. They're very nervous. The AmCham Shanghai guys, you watch their Twitter feed, they're trying to walk it back a little bit. Sorry, we have the record. We have a record. I've been keeping record, and I've got files.
Yeah, the technology companies, yes, they have.
Sorry?
I say you're talking about the technology companies really help the CCP. Yeah, they censor the internet on the internet. Yeah. Anything that would displease the CCP, they will try to, to cover it up. Yeah, that's the technology. And also the Wall Street, the bankers, they got so much, money to fund the CCP. And that's Wall Street. And also these politicians. So specifically, what is your view about, for example, like the big VIPs like Bloomberg and Schwarzman? Yeah. You must have lots of things to talk about.
Absolutely. I grew up with these people.
Oh, wow.
I know them intimately. I've met almost all of them. I've never met Mark Zuckerberg or Tim Cook, but I know exactly who and what they are. And I think this goes back to what my project was. My project was to create a truth pledge and send it to all of these people who outsourced American jobs and American medicine to China, communist China, which is probably going to end up with a lot of people dying because they won't be able to get penicillin in the next few months, because you can't rebuild these factories right away. It's going to take time to bring all the factories back from America. Forget about shoes, forget about clothes. It's high tech, it's Boeing, it's medicines, it's technology. Let's not even get into weapon systems, which have also been sent over to the PRC. Why, God knows. But so I wrote a truth pledge one night. I think it was around the time I went and I stood in front of the Xinhua Tower when it was first unveiled to the public.
Yeah.
And the truth pledge basically said, do you acknowledge that the Chinese Communist Party is responsible for the deaths of 80 million of its own people?
Yeah.
Do you acknowledge that you saw the carnage in Tiananmen Square? Do you acknowledge that the Dalai Lama is a refugee in India because the Chinese Communist Party invaded his country, killed 1.5, maybe 2 million Tibetans? Do you acknowledge that there are at least 1.5, some figures say 2, some figures say 5 million human beings in concentration camps in Xinjiang? I'm now adding to the truth pledge for a recent history. And I updated it over the last Christmas to add Hong Kong. Do you acknowledge that the CCP is violating the one country, two systems pledge that they made to the people of Hong Kong? And do you acknowledge that there is police brutality in Hong Kong that shocks the conscience of mankind? Do you? And I would like to send it to all of them. So we need a big backer for this to see if they answer us or not. I have a feeling that, it's always with us Tibet people. No, it's not convenient. We can't meet you today. They couldn't completely slam the door in my face because I was the daughter of a very powerful senator. That's the only thing I had going for me. And so I was relentless. I knocked on every single door. I went to every humanitarian organization. I went to every human rights organization. I lobbied senators again and again. But after my father died, to my face, I was told by every single humanitarian organization, these aren't even the bankers. These are people whose mission statement is to help the students in Hong Kong who've been beaten viciously by the police, or the Tibetan refugees who escaped, like my friend Palingatsu. And we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about this later. And to my face, they said, we can't work with you, Maura. You're a Tibet person, and our board members have interests in China. Now, I was told that by Human Rights Watch, Human Rights First, Freedom House, all these organizations. So I would say to them, are you telling me that you're siding with a totalitarian dictatorship that tortures children in concentration camps over His Holiness Dalai Lama, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate and the greatest Buddhist master of our time? Is that what you're telling me? And you know what they would do? They wouldn't answer. They wouldn't.
That's a difficult question.
Well, they're
making them ashamed.
They should say, Maura, you got a point. At least one older man at Freedom House, which was created by Eleanor Roosevelt after World War II. Let's remember, most of these organizations were created after the Holocaust, after the catastrophe of the Nazi control of Europe and World War II, in which 6 million European Jews were slaughtered in concentration camps. And today, people are tortured in CCP concentration camps with methods of cruelty that would make a Nazi proud. I have spent years interviewing mostly Tibetans, but Uyghur and Chinese friends as well, who somehow survived being in a Chinese prisoner concentration camp. Again, arrested for counter-revolutionary thought, like Dr. Li and Liu Xiaobo. So I think now we have an opportunity to do things like this truth pledge, to at least embarrass and shame and expose the collaborators. I know that with Mr. Guo, one thing you do is the exposed revolution.
Yes.
Which I think is wonderful.
Yeah.
Which is
we shame them and name them. Yes.
Name them and shame them.
Shame them. Yes.
Shame them and name them.
Yeah. Yeah. So, a question. So, according to your personal experience, how has the political sentiment towards the CCP changed over the years?
I've never seen it change so fast than it has since the pandemic forced the lockdown of our great cities.
All
And
right.
it's taking away people we love, 3 per minute.
Mm.
I'm now getting phone calls from friends, thoughtful, intelligent people, educated people, sophisticated New Yorkers and people I knew. I used to also live in Boston and Washington. I'm an East Coast. I come from the East Coast elite. So these are educated people, thoughtful people. And for years and years, they'd roll their eyes. Oh, Maura, come on. You know, if Bill Gates says it's okay to work with China, if Bill Clinton says it's okay to work with China, if Steve Schwarzman started the Schwarzman Scholars and he said about 3 years ago on public television, he was committing $100 million to train the future leaders of the Chinese Communist Party. Well, American kids get saddled with debt for going to college, but if you're Chinese communist, it's easier to get into Harvard, Princeton, and Yale. Xi Jinping's daughter, by the way, went to Harvard as an undergraduate. She was in class of 2014, but they also gave her a pseudonym, and Harvard totally collaborated with this. And a friend of mine who is was an admissions counselor at Princeton and later at Harvard said, if your father is a Chinese communist, it's much easier to get into a top college than if your grandfather built that college. That's the situation. So back to what your question was. I'm sorry, I got a little off topic. People are calling me in tears saying, Maura, you were right. You were right. You were right about China. I'm sorry I didn't listen more. I'm sorry I didn't pay attention more. But Maura, I'm really glad you did bring it to my attention, because at least it was sort of in the back of my mind that something's wrong here. It's not quite right.
Yeah. Yeah. But this is such a high price to pay.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, for them to learn it finally.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, it's too high.
It is too high.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and thank you so much. So we talk about the CCP's accomplices. Maura's Moxie. How have the American elites whitewashed the CCP's crimes? For example, oppressing political dissidents and Tibetans.
You go to a bookstore, and again, after the CCP virus and the death toll and the carnage, this may change. But with the normalization of the CCP that the American elites have worked so hard on since 1972, when the Kissinger Doctrine was first implemented, which is we've got to embrace the Soviet Union. There was this gamble of détente. Let's work with communist China to contain the Soviet Union. And my father said, you know, that was a foolish strategy, because any cab driver in Moscow could tell you everybody in Russia was broke. And one difference between the Chinese communists and the old Bolsheviks of the Soviet Union is that the old Soviet Union was economically isolated. And so when Gorbachev, who was a man I greatly admire, who allowed the peaceful dissolution of the Soviet Union. And I grew up in the time of mutual assured destruction between America and the Soviet Union. We used to have fire drills in case there was an atom bomb. And we were told we had to hate Russians. And there was this, you know, terrible sense that any moment there could be a nuclear cataclysm of Russia attacking America. Well, so he came along, Gorbachev, and he allowed the peaceful dissolution of the Soviet Union. As I think most of your viewers will know, he came to Beijing in the spring of 1989, when the students had gathered in Tiananmen Square after the death of Yu Yaobong. And you forgive my Mandarin pronunciation, but Yu Yaobong was a man I greatly admired because he was a CCP reformer, and he went to Tibet in 1971 and 72, and he wrote a white paper that condemned the CCP for the brutal and cruel treatment of the Tibetan people. And so he was always a hero to the Tibetan people, that he had the courage to stand up to Mao and say, look what we've done. We've got to do better. If we're going to annex these countries, we've got to do better. And so Gorbachev comes at that time, and we were very hopeful, a lot of us, that this could be a moment where there would be change in China, where they would follow the example of Gorbachev and dismantle the Communist Party and try something else. If not
Unfortunately.
a Swedish-style democracy, at least something that wasn't the Communist Party. Which, by the way, this is one thing when I argue with Western elites, I always say, you know, communism is not a Chinese philosophy.
No.
Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1851 in the British Museum Library of London. He was a German bourgeois. He called himself an intellectual. I think his writing is horrible. And a lot of, and this goes back to the normalization of the CCP. You hear a lot of academics in America say, oh, Marx was such a wonderful writer and Mao was such a wonderful writer. I beg to disagree. I think you read them, it's like the gruntings of an asura, a dundre, or demigod. Asura is Sanskrit for a demon, and dundre is Tibetan for demon. And I reread parts of the Communist Manifesto a couple months ago. Every now and then I go on the Marx page, you know, the website, and it made me sick. It made me sick. It goes back, and so these elites that explain away the crimes of the Chinese Communist Party also seem to have forgotten about the Holocaust.
Mm.
They seem to have forgotten that fascism and communism are very similar, of course, as we know. Now, this book is a laugh out loud gut buster. It's comedy, but it's not. It doesn't intend to be comedic, but it's outrageous and it's shocking and it's sort of a joke at the same time. Doing Business in China for Dummies. And there is not one mention in here that China is a communist country. You won't find a reference to the Communist Party. You will in China Business Etiquette, because they've got to cover their ass, because the Shanghai Amchang Shanghai gang, pardon me, I'll say that again. You won't find any mention of the Chinese Communist Party in, you won't find any mention of it in Doing Business in China for Dummies. Well, you will in Doing a Chinese Business Etiquette, because this is a project of the Amchang Shanghai gang. And they are based in China and they got to cover their ass a little bit. And you should see what they say in here about the Cultural Revolution, which was a terrible tragedy for the Chinese people, as every Chinese person knows, especially a lot of the Hong Kong intellectuals who lived into it, the freedom swimmers who swam, got to Canton and managed to swim to Hong Kong, and the stories they told of the atrocities, the burning of books, the torture and persecution of intellectuals. They say, oh, well, the Cultural Revolution was kind of a blip, but we're over that now. Well, we're certainly not over it in Tibet. We're certainly not over in Xinjiang. And what about Liu Xiaobo? What about his wife, who managed to escape last summer to Germany? Thank goodness. A woman I want to meet one day. I've painted many portraits of Liu Xiaobo. And on our interview, we'll talk about my art. But back to the elites, I think it really is just a lack of morality. They can't say they didn't know. That's a lie. They all saw the Tiananmen Square massacre. They can't say that we Tibet people didn't do our best to put evidence of torture in front of them. For example, I am the executive producer of this film. It was directed by my friend Masako Sumera. She's Japanese. It's called Fire Under the Snow. It's based on this book, The Autobiography of a Tibetan Monk by Palden Gyatso. Palden Gyatso died last year in Dharamsala, the home of His Holiness Dalai Lama. He was a Tibetan monk who spent 33 years in the notorious Dropshi prison in Lhasa, the capital of Tibet. His crime was the same of Liu Xiaobo and Dr. Li, counter-revolutionary thought. He was a Buddhist monk. For that reason, they put electric cattle prods into his mouth. They starved him, they whipped him, they beat him. You'll find photographs in here of the destruction of Tibetan monasteries. And he managed to smuggle the torture instruments that were used on him. He smuggled them out. Right here. Are the electric cattle prods, the knives, the other tools, torture tools that they would use on Tibetan prisoners of conscience. He had the electric cattle prod put in his mouth many times. He lost all his teeth. So when he came into exile, we were able to pay for him to go to the dentist and get dentures. And I have several Tibetan friends who were Buddhist nuns who were caught with small photographs of the Dalai Lama that were hidden. For this, which is considered a crime under Chinese law, Chinese communist law, they were raped with electric cattle prods. They had electric cattle prods put in to their bodies. And most of the girls will die of blood loss when this happens, but a few of them were able to escape into Nepal and then to India, and one is living in New Jersey now. And you should have her on your show. She speaks English very well.
All right. Okay.